His wounds have paid my ransom.
Thank you. You may be seated.
Well, good morning. We're going to complete our series today on money that we've been going over the last couple of weeks. And, last couple of weeks we've talked about our relationship with money, and we've talked about our stewardship or our managing of money. And today we're going to take kind of that next step and going from this reflection on how money is treasured in our lives and how we handle it, to asking a question that I think many people ask, especially Christians, people who are wanting to be faithful with their money. They ask the question, how much is it that God wants me to give back to Him or back to His work in whatever way it may be, and that comes across our radars. And so that's the question that we're going to be addressing today. And the good news is that God gives us instruction on this, and He helps us on this. The bad news is that for some of us, this very question kind of can bring up some difficult emotions in us. Some things such as resentment. Or maybe the things such as giving to a church is just a membership fee, like would be to any other club that you're a member of. Or maybe that paying or the giving to the church is a lot like paying a bill. Any other bill you might have that you kind of see it, view it, the emotion is the same, that you pay it because you got to pay it and it comes across your desk, however. Some people give and they know it's good, they understand the goodness of it, but they don't really like it. It's just what we do because we know we need to, right? For some, giving is really a joy. It's really a privilege, an act of worship, and they really get excited about that opportunity to give in different ways. So we each kind of approach this idea of giving to the church, giving back to God, with different emotions, different levels, different things, depending on our background, depending on how it is we see our money, depending on how we see the church and what God is asking of us. God actually does give us a lot of instruction on this, and we're going to start in the Old Testament today, and we're going to start there and then come to the New Testament to see what the picture we get there is. And we're going to hit several different verses, but the one we're going to spend the most time in is 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 9. So if you'd like to turn there, we'll get there in a few moments. We're going to hit some others in the meantime, but that is where we'll spend the bulk of our time. We're going to start in the Old Testament, in the Levitical laws, because that is where this idea of tithing and giving to God begins. That's where it's first laid out for us. God created the laws, the Mosaic law, the laws that He gave in the book of Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and Leviticus. He did this for a number of reasons. So it was a way of governing the people and giving them kind of governmental order. It was a way of separating His people, making them culturally different from the people around them. It also had the purpose of teaching right and wrong. And so the various aspects and elements of the law had some of these different purposes depending on which elements that you're talking about. And this included laws on money, on giving and tithing and giving back to God. And so I've tried to really study through this, although I'll tell you the more I study into the Levitical tithing laws, the more complicated I actually realize they are. It appears on the surface to be kind of just simple and straightforward. And then when you dig into it, even amongst Jewish scholars that I would go into and see how they interpreted and understood these, there was disagreement, and they recognized their disagreement on it. And so I'm going to do my best, so far as I can tell, to help us understand the Jewish tithing laws. And there were three primary Jewish tithing laws. And before we get into those, though, I want to talk about this word tithe, because we use this word around church and we don't use it many other places in the world, really. But the word tithe is actually a technical term that is more of a mathematical term than a religious term. And the word tithe means 10%. Okay? So if you say, I give a tithe, what you're saying is, I give 10%. Okay, it isn't any other number. You can, if you give a different number and you use the word tithe, you're actually contradicting yourself. So if you say I tithe 5%, you're saying I give 10% 5%. Like, it's a contradiction of terms, okay? Because it is a technical term. It means 10%. And so as we walk through this, as we'll see in a bit, you can give in a different amount if you'd like, but the term tithe just doesn't apply to it. And the term tithe applies because in God's laws, we're going to see He actually intended the amount to be 10%, okay? And so we just want to make sure we're clear on the number that the word tithe means 10%, okay? And so as we look at the Levitical laws, we're going to start in Numbers chapter 18. And this chapter has a whole list of different ways in which tithing happens, but there's a general theme within this chapter that it indicates the Jewish people were to give a tithe to the Levitical priests, meaning the priests over their temples and in their area. And in this section, it shows that, the priests didn't technically get a salary. Everything that they needed to live was provided for, and it was provided for by this tithe that the people gave. And so even though there wasn't a salary, so to speak, their housing, their food, everything they needed was provided for by this 10%. And so this first tithe had this purpose. And just so you know, out of this, then it also gives instruction in that chapter that the priests were to tithe on the tithe they were given. And so there was, like, the people gave a tithe to the priest, and then the priest gave a tithe back into the work of their ministry as well. And just so you're clear, we do this as a family. I've had people tell me, like, Jeff, it's kind of dumb that you get paid and you tithe off what you're getting paid back to the same people who just paid you. But we tithe because of this, because we believe we want to be contributing to what's happening in our church ministry exactly as I hope you do, and we don't want to be hypocrites in this, and this is an example of why we do this. So we do give back to the church, even though some say, that doesn't make sense. We do that as a family, Deborah and I do. And so this first tithe really had two purposes. The first purpose was to support the priests. The second purpose was more in alignment with today what we would call taxes. Okay, in their time and space, in the way their worlds were constructed, their faith, their religious structures, and their governance were one and the same. We have a separation of church and state. They didn't at all. They were very much combined and put together. And so the operation of one was the operation of the other. And so this tithe went towards both the operation of their temple, of their Jewish leaders and the priests, and their governmental systems, all in one. And so obviously one of the most frequent questions asked in churches is, well, do I give off my gross or my net? And that's a legitimate question, and I appreciate you wrestling with that question if that is something you wrestle with. But as we see from this, that question isn't precisely answered by these laws because of the arrangement is just different, and that what they gave to one was giving to the other. And so for us, that isn't super helpful as we ask the question of knowing exactly what they did. And similarly, I'll be honest, I don't know the answer that if you fast forward a couple thousand years and you go to where there was Jewish government with another foreign governance over the top, and so they would obviously want you to pay taxes to their government, I am not certain how they delineated their percentages. And so that's something interesting that I don't know the answer to, and maybe you can do some research and figure out on my behalf. But it certainly makes our wrestling with that legitimate question less clear. And I think that's on purpose, and we're going to talk to that towards that more here in a little bit. But I think that is a good question, but we don't have as clear of an answer to that as we might hope. And so our first tithe was in Numbers 18. And it went towards the Levitical priests and the operation of the temple and the government. So now we go to the second tithe, and this is found in Deuteronomy 14. And I'm just verse 22 I'm going to read, but there's a larger section. Verse 22 says this: you must be certain to tithe all the produce from your seed that comes from the field year after year. Okay? So in this passage, God is telling the Israelites to give a tithe of all their earnings, of their income. So that's 10% of whatever they earned in whatever ways it was. So whether that was crops, herds, flocks, whether that was in the marketplace, whether that was money, whether it was objects, 10%. Now, there is some interpretational differences here. Some interpret this as net worth, and some interpret this as income, like that annual income. And obviously, that makes a big difference in what that number actually is, whether it's net worth or whether it's income, right? But there's a second tithe that is being tithed, and the purpose of this one is for religious feasts. And in the Old Testament, there was a series of religious feasts or festivals that happened throughout their calendar year, and each of these were important celebrations in which the Jewish people worshiped God, and this was part of their construct of how they worship God. And so these were important sacred times throughout the year. And so this tithe was set aside so that people could worship properly and worship well. And in some cases, those who lived in and around a temple would take their tithe to the temple directly, and was part of that celebration there at the temple. Those who lived further away may not. They might sort of sell it, cash it out, liquidate it, and then use that money for their facilitation of the celebration, but separate from the temple. And so there appears to be kind of different ways in which this operated. There's an interesting little caveat with this as well. It says every third year, they were to not pay it, but to store it, to save it, to help their friends and neighbors who couldn't afford themselves to participate in these feasts and festivals. It was this way of each of us helping one another make sure we can all worship well. We can all be in good standing with God and be in a right relationship. And so I think that's a really beautiful and interesting thing, that every third year, this tithe would be kept to help one another and to really be teammates with each other in how we all worship, and to make sure we can all worship properly. So the second tithe went towards facilitation of the feasts and worshiping God. And then there was a third tithe. This one is also found in Deuteronomy 14, just a little later in that chapter. And in verses 28 and 29, it says this: that at the end of every 3 years, you must bring all the tithe of your produce in that very year, and you must store it up in your villages. Then the Levites, because they have no allotment or inheritance with you, that means they don't have an income or land provision, anything like that, and foreign residents, the orphans and the widows of the village may come and eat their fill, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work you do. And so this tithe is every third year as well, kind of like the caveat from the last one. But this one was for people to tithe off their income, take it to a community storehouse of some kind for the purpose of meeting the needs of the priests, the widows, the orphans, and foreign residents living in that community, those who didn't have. This was a kind of social welfare system, that the people who needed and didn't have had a place to come. And so the entire community was expected to tithe every third year towards this cause. And so if you think about it, that's, whether you're saving all the time for it or whether you're setting aside every third year, it's like 3%, 3.33% set aside as this, again, social welfare system where we all come together to make sure all of our needs are met. And so these appear to be the big three tithes that are laid out, but there are other places for offerings and gifts to be given as well. Deuteronomy gives us a statement that nobody should ever go to the temple empty-handed. So even if it's above and beyond your other gifts, you should never come without some kind of sacrifice. Leviticus 19 discusses the corners of fields, and we talked about this when we studied the book of Ruth earlier this year, that you were to leave the corners of your fields uncut so that those that are poor in the community can come and harvest for themselves and have a way of being provided for. Exodus 22 talks about giving interest-free loans to one another, that if someone is in need, we would loan and there would be no interest charged, and that's a way of helping one another out. And then Exodus 35 discusses other free will offerings. And so there we see that there aren't just these three tithes. There are other ways in which people were expected as well to give towards the work of the community and of God in their community. And so if you've been doing the math in your head, depending on how you want to calculate that third year, whether you're dumping it all in at once or you're stretching it out over the 3 years, you're somewhere at about 23% plus or minus whatever, then however you're budgeting out that third year is what these would total up to. And again, the math changes if we're talking about net worth versus just annual income. That's the annual income number. If you calculated that second one as net worth, the number goes higher, we would assume, having a positive net worth. And so that is what would have been expected amongst the people in the Old Testament time in terms of properly tithing or giving a series of tithes to the work of God and back to the temple. And so then the question becomes, how does all of this apply to you and I today? In this system of giving, is this what we're being called to? Is this the expectation God has on us, or is there something different? Because if this is the expectation, you're probably doing what I would be, and you're breaking out the mental calculator, and you're going, okay, and you're carrying the one, what is that number for me, right? But is that what actually is being asked of us? So let's go to the New Testament and see what Jesus teaches us in the New Testament that helps us understand what was happening here in the Old Testament. So we're going to begin in Matthew 5, which is where we've kind of been hanging out here in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 with the Sermon on the Mount the last couple weeks, because Jesus makes a statement that I think is important, that sort of sets our understanding, the table for our understanding of how Old Testament law translates to New Testament. That is in Matthew 5, verse 17. Jesus says this. He says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them." What Jesus is doing here is he's putting two words sort of in opposition to each other, the word abolish and the word fulfill. The word abolish means to loosen or to destroy or to dissolve something. So Jesus has said, I have not come to loosen or dissolve or destroy the Old Testament law. Instead, I've come to fulfill it. And this idea of fulfillment is the idea of bringing to completion, bringing to its fullest, bringing to its completion. And so we want to think about then what was intended by that Old Testament law, and how do we see in Jesus' life and in his teaching that those ideas, those concepts are brought to their fullest, brought to their completion, because he didn't come to destroy it. He came to complete it. He is our salvation. He is our example. He is our identity. He is who we are to be following. He is where our faith is, not in the law. And so we need to look and see how it is he plays out this fulfillment, how he teaches us that it works. And right after that verse in Matthew 5, he goes into 6 examples. And this would be a great thing for you to study if you'd like on your own. He gives 6 examples of 6 different Old Testament laws that then he teaches on. And he teaches that how that law has a greater depth, a greater richness to it, a greater completion to it than just simply the law itself states. So those categories, if you will, the next 6 are our values of one another, sex and marriage, divorce and marriage, the integrity of our words, justice and resistance, and revenge and respect. In each of these categories, Jesus references Old Testament law, and then he shows the depth that goes underneath those. And so a couple examples out of that is do not murder. That's one of the 10 commandments, right? We know that clearly from the Old Testament law, that we are not to murder. What Jesus teaches in this paragraph on that subject is that it is not just don't murder. It's that we would value one another enough that we would not even hate each other. Right? You get the depth, the difference. It's not that do not murder is crossed out. It's there, but there's a depth of understanding and meaning underneath of it that we have to understand that to understand why it is that we're not to murder one another. Another example from that little section is do not commit adultery. That's another clear law from the Old Testament, right? Well, he goes on to teach in there the value of marriage and the value of our marital commitments to one another. That yes, we are not to commit adultery, but there's a depth and a breadth of why underneath it. That because there's greater value to our marriages and our commitments than is cheapened by committing adultery to one another. Okay, so he does this where he creates this depth and this more full picture of what the law actually was as he teaches about it. And I believe he does the same thing in the New Testament with tithing and the tithing laws. He demonstrates that as we are to live in him, our lives in him, as we are to follow him, to be faithful to him. It isn't just following a bunch of rules. It isn't just checking a box of I've never broken that one. But there is a heart, there is an understanding that is deeply rooted underneath it. And as we understand that understanding under that law, it's like that law raises the bar of what it means to be faithful to him in such a way. And so, as we look at those Old Testament tithing laws, what I believe Jesus is going to show us is that the purpose of those tithes and those offerings was for us to be generous. And that the depth he's going to give and that the way the bar gets raised is that it isn't about a math equation as much as it is a heart of generosity. That Jesus manifests this generosity for us as an example in how he was generous in making the ultimate sacrifice on our behalf, and how he demonstrated through his life his generosity of holding his life completely open-handed to God's use and however God would call him to work and to do what God was calling him to do. And that we are to use him as an example of how to follow him. The law no longer binds us, but rather we are bound by our obedience to him, by our faithfulness to him, that we would reflect him as we live, not just simply check the box of a law. And so as we look through the New Testament, we ask ourselves, do we see this reflected in the rest of the New Testament? And it's interesting that the term tithe is only found 4 times in the New Testament. And each of those 4 times are simply citing the Old Testament. None of them are instructive. The New Testament never says you should tithe. Instead, it reflects back on the Old Testament and the tithe from the Old Testament. In contrast, the mentioning of giving or being generous or sharing with one another in this kind of language is all over the New Testament. It's everywhere. You look in the book of Acts and it's just soaked with it as you see the early church being very generous with each other. Just the examples are over and over and over of generosity being poured out in the early church. And one of the richest examples of this in Scripture comes in 2 Corinthians, the passage I had you turn to earlier, and that's where we're going to spend the rest of our time today. This is an interesting passage, and the situation that it's addressing is actually not found in any one exact place, but you can find it throughout the book of Acts, and then it's picked up in a couple places in Paul's letters. But what Paul is doing is he takes 3 missionary journeys throughout what today we would call Turkey and Greece and that part of the world, the Balkans part of the world. And as doing so, he knows that the people in Jerusalem, the church in Jerusalem, is suffering great persecution. And there's a famine, and there's just a lot of sort of things coming together in Jerusalem, making life really hard for the Jerusalem church. And so as he goes on these journeys, he is collecting an offering from the people so that he can take back to Jerusalem, because he is dead set on getting back to Jerusalem. And his real purpose in doing so is to deliver this offering back to the church in Jerusalem. And so this passage is where we learn about one of the churches, where he's telling the Corinthians about one of the other churches, the church in Macedonia, and how it is they gave towards this cause. And so let's begin. We're just going to skip through this. It's such a deep, kind of a thick passage. We're not going to have time to look at every verse, but we're going to start in chapter 8, verse 1, and go through chapter 9, verse 15, and kind of skip our way through this. Verse 1. Now we make known to you, brothers and sisters, the grace of God given to the churches of Macedonia. Now, I want to stop there because as we're going to see, the reason why he's bringing up Macedonia is because of their generosity. So what he is referring to here is he is calling their generosity, he's calling the ability to give a grace of God. And grace is, and this undeserved favor, this undeserved gift, that they had this gift, the ability to give, that was totally unmerited on their part. But it was simply a gift from God that they were able to give. And you and I, in the same way, have been extended much grace by God in many different ways. Things we don't deserve, but he gives us because he loves us and he's generous and he's just an overwhelmingly kind God. And one of those gifts is the ability to give. One of those gifts is the ability for us to be a part of his work in any number of different ways, but even financially, that we would be able to give some of what is ours that we learned last week is really his, towards what he is doing. And so Paul sees this generosity as a grace, as an undeserved favor. And we keep going, verse 2 through 4, that during a severe ordeal of suffering, there, the Macedonians, abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in the wealth of their generosity. For I testify they gave according to their means and beyond their means. They did so voluntarily, begging us with great earnestness for the blessing and fellowship of helping the saints. Now, I think it's interesting. Did you notice the math equation there in verse 2? That severe suffering plus abundant joy plus extreme poverty equals overflowing generosity. That's not a math equation we'd normally put together, would it? Most of us think that like extreme wealth and life on easy street and God all together equals great generosity, but that's not what happened here with the Macedonians. That giving is not obligatory. Nobody is forced to. We get to choose to, and they chose to, even in the face of great turmoil, of extreme suffering, of extreme poverty. They had a heart of generosity towards the others. They longed for the opportunity. I think it's interesting that they begged. It said they voluntarily begging us with great earnestness. When was the last time you begged to give to something? You begged because nobody has asked you to give, but you want to. Like you just feel compelled to give. Like my heart just wants to, and I just have to give. Have you ever had somebody give something to you, something sacrificial that you knew they really couldn't afford? That was truly an inconvenience for them, truly a difficulty, a sacrifice on their behalf for your benefit. Have you ever had that happen? It's actually an incredibly humbling thing. For me, it's extremely hard to accept those gifts. I remember when we were in South Asia last fall, they say the average folk there make like $100 to $150 a month. And they laid out a feast before us that you eat yourself sick. And they're bringing you more and more and more food. And you feel bad that you have to say, look, I can't eat anymore. And they just have great joy in bringing it. And you're like, I don't need this. You need this. And they just pour it out. They beg for the privilege, the opportunity to serve you. Have you ever had something like that? Where somebody just wants to give, even though they can't. They can, but it's a huge sacrifice. This develops fellowship. This develops this appreciation, this unity to one another, of helping each other out, of binding us together when we sacrifice for each other, when we give when we don't have to, when we receive when we may find it hard to receive. These things actually bring us together. And they were giving out of extreme poverty. That's a hard thing for us to define because we live in the wealthiest place that's ever existed on planet Earth. But this actually, all around us, most of the planet lives on very little. We are extremely blessed. For many of us, even in the midst of so much wealth, we do struggle. Like we struggle to have enough to keep the ends meeting because our costs are higher just like our incomes are higher, right? And other places in the world where costs are lower and their incomes are lower. So we struggle, and it can be really hard. But many of us, we actually aren't in that position. We actually have a lot. We have more than enough. And I include myself in this, that often we sacrifice generosity because of poor stewardship. That's why we started there last week. And we sacrifice it because our heart is in the wrong place. That's why we started there 2 weeks ago. That really we sacrifice generosity because of our own decisions, not because of our circumstances. And here we get an example from the Macedonians of how they did not allow that to be the case. They did not allow their circumstances to squelch their heart of generosity, their desire to give, and even begging to give beyond what they should have. I try to imagine being Paul in that conversation when they keep bringing things, and he's like, no, you need this too. And they're like, no, we want to keep giving and keep giving. Go to verse 9. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that although he was rich, he became poor for your sake, so that you, by his poverty, could become rich. Jesus is our example of generosity. We've already mentioned this, his self-sacrifice. That if we are going to be following him well, we will follow this example well as well. And that we will want to give generously and sacrificially. That there will be this part of us that knows it's going to be uncomfortable. That what God is going to call us to do is going to be a bit uncomfortable. And we're going to have to make some sacrifices so that we can give. We're not going to be able to have all the wants so that we can contribute as God is calling us to. It's probably going to hurt a little. But if we're following his example, that's exactly what he did. He hurt a lot for you and for I. And we can follow him in this way. In verse 12, it says, for if the eagerness is present, the gift itself is acceptable according to whatever one has, not according to what one does not have. You are only responsible for what you have. You're not responsible for what you don't have. And as this statement says, if the eagerness is present, if it's the heart of generosity, it's the desire, that willingness, that heart position is more important than the amount. It's our heart. That's why the 10% isn't as helpful as we might think it is. Because you can give your 10%, your tithe, you can check the box and have no heart of generosity at all. You can give huge percentages of your income. You can slap down 50% if you want. But if you're bitter about it, if you're doing it begrudgingly or with ulterior motives, you might as well have kept it. Because that's not what God's concerned about. He's concerned about your heart. This levels the playing field. Whether you're the widow with a single mite, that story we get in Scripture, or whether you're a wealthy person with lots of zeros in your check, it doesn't matter. It's your heart. It's your desire to give and to be a part of what God is doing. Go on to verses 13 and 14. For I do not say this so there would be relief for others and suffering for you, but as a matter of equality. At the present time, your abundance will meet their need, so that one day their abundance may also meet your need, and thus there would be equality. See, when we are generous, it establishes teamwork. It brings us together. There are some times when you're going to be in need. And if we're a generous community, we will give to help meet those needs. And there will be some other times when another person is in need, and you will get the privilege to decide whether or not you want to contribute to their needs. But as we do this over and over, and this web of generosity is developed, it actually brings us together. It actually unifies us because we have been on both the giving and receiving side of one another's generosity, and that actually bonds us together. And when we look around, not just interpersonally, but within ministry, and we understand that different ones of us have given so that this ministry or this event or whatever has happened to take place, that we all know we are invested, that nobody is kind of opting out and sitting on the sideline. And when we all know we're in it, it strengthens us as a team, as a church. And so giving brings us together. It's important for us all to participate so that we all can be unified as a body. We jump to chapter 9, verse 6. Paul says, "My point is this: the person who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the person who sows generously will also reap generously." Just like any investment, if you don't invest, you don't get a return. You can't sit on the sideline and expect a return. And so the way you invest impacts your return. If you put in pennies, don't expect dollars back. But if you invest generously, then you can expect a great return. And remember last week, God's economy isn't the same as ours. This isn't a one-for-one thing, right? You can't invest and then be sitting here saying, "All right, God, where's my payback on this?" That's not how it works, right? We talked about that. But we can't expect for God's work, for the ministry, for our lives, our church, our unity, all these things to thrive if we're not investing in them. We must invest generously if we want to see generous results on the other side. And then verse 7, "Each one of you should give just as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, because God loves a cheerful giver." That's a really important sentence. It's one that helps to answer our question, how much? See, I think God intends for this topic of how much we give to be soaked in prayer, to be every bit as much of our prayer life as lots of other things. To be something that we have this ongoing conversation with God. On God, do you want me to give to this opportunity, to this church, to this ministry, to whatever it may be that comes across the radar of our lives? God, do you want me to be generous? That we would hold our lives open-handed, that there would be this communication with God. There would be this abiding, this obeying that happens. We would not reduce our giving to a math equation that just simply gets spit out of the budget each month and we don't give it any thought at all, because remember, it's about the heart of things. It's heart of generosity. Because God cares about our hearts. And so we should be thoughtful, we should be prayerful about our giving. Verse 13, "Through the evidence of this service, they will glorify God because of your obedience to your confession in the gospel of Christ and the generosity of your sharing with them and with everyone." See, when we're generous, it creates thanksgiving. It creates worship. When we give, we get to worship. We get to be thankful that we have, and we have the ability to give and for the grace of giving. But also by giving, we give others, those on the receiving side, whomever that may be, the ability to worship as well, to grow, to continue to thrive in their faith, people to be reached. Giving, good giving, produces thanksgiving, produces worship when we give generously. In verse 15, the last one of this section, says, "Thanks be to God for this indescribable gift." Do we actually view the ability to give as an indescribable gift? What a perspective. Do you sense the difference between the Old Testament giving laws and the New Testament view of giving and generosity? Like, for me, it's just like this palpable difference. Like, there's a clear difference. You sense, you feel the depth, the richness of what Jesus and then Paul in Corinthians was trying to communicate. And I think about the early Christians, the folks that are in the the New Testament times, converting from Judaism to following Jesus. And they must have felt that difference even greater than us, because they lived under both systems. They lived coming out of one into another. They did not consider tithing to be an appropriate standard for giving. There's this interesting thing I found, that in New Testament history and in what we call early church history, the next century or two, we actually have no evidence that the early church tithed. None. But we have incredible history and telling of their generosity. There was an early church father named Irenaeus, who lived in the 2nd century. He considered tithing to be a Jewish law not required of Christians. And that Christians had received, quote, liberty, and should consequently give without external constraint. You understand what he's saying? That the tithing system was too constraining upon generosity. That with the tithing system, it was too easy to say, that's how much I give. That percentage, and it constrains us, that our generosity should go beyond that system. That system is constraining. Essentially what he's saying is that whether you count it as 10% or 23% or X percent of your net whatever, that percentage is too constraining. That we should have more freedom, he believes in Jesus, to just be generous however it is we're called to be generous. That we should hold things that open-handed. And obviously the Macedonian church that Paul was referring to here saw it that way. They understood that. They had been liberated from 10%. There's no percentages giving. I'm confident they went well beyond that. So why is it that we like the 10%? Why is it that we tend to revert back to that as our standard? And let's be honest here for a moment. This is hard to hear, but statistics tell us that in churchgoers in the U.S., like about 2, 3, maybe in some places 4% of those attending give a tithe. Most give far less. And so let's not pretend for a second here that like tithing is what actually happens. It's not. And the reason why it doesn't is because of mammon and poor stewardship. That's why we talked about those week 1 and 2. But we like 10%. Because it's measurable. Like we can check the box. We can know, have I met that standard? Have I come to this goal? We like to know where like that line in the sand is that we have to get to, right? And so when it's a percentage, we know right there is the line. It also makes it easier because I don't have to think about it. I don't have to pray. I don't have to abide. I don't have to really be in relationship with God. I don't have to communicate with him. All I have to do is do the equation. And there's the number, and write the check. But I believe God wants far more from us from that. That he wants our hearts. That he wants this to be something that we spend time with him on, like we do so many other things in life. That we remember that everything belongs to him, and he has authority over it, so we should go to him as good stewards and hold it all out open-handed and say, God, what would you like back? That means we have to steward our lives in such a way there's enough margin for us to do that, which can be hard, but we have to do it. We have to figure out what is a need, what is a want, what is enough extra, quote unquote, so that he can call us to be generous, however it is that he calls us to. In the same way that God raised the bar on the Old Testament law by giving it depth, he's done that with tithing as well. It aligns with our church value of uncomfortable generosity. There's no set amount. It's uncomfortable and it's generous. We believe that's what he's called us to, is to be uncomfortably generous. I don't know if you've ever done this exercise before. I often hear this exercise around times when somebody maybe has a career crisis that they're trying to work their way through. But they ask this question. They say, imagine that money was no object, that money was not a thing, and you could do whatever you wanted to do the rest of your life. What would you do? You ever wrestled through this? Maybe you've been in one of those places in life where you've asked that question. That's actually how I ended up in ministry, was that question. I want to take that question and just turn it a little bit and ask this. What kind of ministry could be accomplished if money was no object? What kind of impact could be made in our community if money was no object? You know, our mission statement here is that we're cultivating followers of Jesus to impact our world. So what kind of impact could we make, could the church as a whole, the capital C church, make if money wasn't an object? Our vision statement is that by God's grace, we'd be the hands and feet of Jesus, willing to get dirty in the weeds of life. How many places could we go get dirty and helping people through struggles with their weeds and give them blessing and new life and freedom in ways they'd never experienced? How many ways could we do that if money was no object, if it was no constraint? How many community problems could we solve? There's been a group of us lately that have been thinking about this. We've been thinking about, like, what are the big things in our community that we could help address? And often we think of something and we're like, yeah, but that's way bigger than we can address. What if it wasn't? What kind of impact could we make? How many lives could we change? How many more people could we bring to know Jesus and have their lives absolutely turned upside down for him? How could we grow and mature and disciple people in ways we can't if money was no object? I firmly believe that if the church, the capital C church, our local church, if we were generous as God is telling us to, that so many of these barriers would disappear. That we would be hunting down, trying to find creative new ways to impact our communities and bring people to Jesus. That we'd be looking for ways to try to spend it. What would it look like for us to give generously? What would the impacts be? I pray that each of us today would leave here and would be giving our generosity a prayerful consideration. That it would be more than a math equation. That it would be something we actually go and talk to God about and are willing to listen to what he has to say. Would you pray with me, please? Father, you call us to such high and beautiful things. God, the depth of our understanding of you through Jesus is challenging to us. God, it's so beautiful, it's so amazing, but it's so challenging. Whether it's how we see one another, through valuing each other to the point where we couldn't hate each other, or whether it's our finances, God. Following you is so amazing and so challenging. God, would you give us clarity? Would you give us insight into what it looks like for us to be faithful with our money? Would you help us to ensure, as we've been talking about, that we don't have mammon on our throne, but you? That we would be stewarding well, that we would be asking you how you want us to manage our money, and in the same way you would ask us how you'd like us to be generous and give to your causes. God, would you continue to grow our hearts towards you and our obedience towards you in this area? And even the most generous of us, God, would you not allow us to get too comfortable? But help us all to be uncomfortably generous. So, Father, thank you. Thank you for this grace of allowing us to participate in your work in this way. God, we ask this in Jesus' name.